William Wilberforce, two great objects. Let it not be said that I was silent when I ought to have spoken. Have you ever heard of William Wilberforce? How does a man who reshaped an entire empire get forgotten? It is not by accident. His greatest achievements are the ones you might find online if you know what to look for, and they by far dwarf his most dangerous achievements. What is so dangerous that this man and his life's work had to be obscured shortly after he died? Wilberforce was in a powerful position of influence, and he declared that the common man could and should be self-sufficient and led by Jesus and guided in this world by his Bible. In an age where men ruled by fear and fought to wear down lesser classes so they could not revolt, this one man sought for decades to lift them up. Wilberforce was dangerous to secular and state-centered ideologies in his time and in ours. His influence reached past his own nation and all the way to the Vatican, offending those who didn't bend the knee to King Jesus. He didn't offer a political revolution. On the contrary, he worked hard against the French revolutionary ideas spreading like a cancer through England. So that was not what made him dangerous and therefore to be neglected in history. Nor was it petitioning for a government handout at a time that governments did not spend 1 cent on the poor, but took every last penny and every drop of sweat and labor they could from the common man. Wilberforce abhorred welfare, yet sought what terrifies all tyrants today. Wilberforce sought a moral transformation by practical means, by educating and providing resources for self-sufficiency. He believed that when the common man is literate, he can learn how to be self-sufficient, and more important, dangerously more important, he can learn of God through reading for himself the Bible and be governed by the law of God, and therefore he becomes a great benefit to society, truly free and impossible to oppress and control. Let us look into the extraordinary life of William Wilberforce, starting with the man whom God raised up to steer Wilberforce in the right direction. John Newton was a profane sailor who by all accounts was good for nothing, and became a slave himself in Africa, and rose to captain a slave ship. And then God reached his heart for the kingdom, and John Newton would write the most heart-piercing hymn in America, Amazing Grace, and also encourage and inspire and mentor William Wilberforce. Newton plays a central role in Wilberforce's life at three places where Wilberforce had to make a difficult life-altering choice. Each time Newton gave valuable Christian advice, and Wilberforce was humble and took it. Wilberforce was born in 1759, and King George III was on the throne. While history books often remember King George III as the mad king who lost the American colonies, he stood out as a rare and notable exception to the advanced moral decay of the royal court around him. He was a deeply pious man, an intensely faithful husband to his wife, Queen Charlotte, and a doting father who read the Bible to his daughters every night. sincerely desiring to set a holy example for his subjects. This brings us to his incredible intersection with William Wilberforce. In 1787, the exact same year Wilberforce wrote down his two great goals, King George III issued a historic royal decree called the Proclamation for the Encouragement of Piety and Virtue. Wilberforce brilliantly seized upon the king's royal decree, using it as the ultimate political launchpad for his second great objective, the reformation of manners. By leveraging the moral authority of the king himself, Wilberforce was able to unite politicians, bishops, and elite citizens to fight against national vice, protect the vulnerable, and push for the mass education of the poor. Though the king would later tragically lose his mind to illness, God used this faithful monarch's early passion for virtue to ignite a spiritual fire that Wilberforce would carry through the halls of Parliament for the next 4 decades. William Wilberforce's grandfather, also a William Wilberforce, was a powerful, highly wealthy merchant whose last name really was Wilberforce. Now, the Wilbur part meant fortress, and that sounded good to the grandfather. But Foss, it could be translated as servant, and the more original usage was ditch. And the grandfather, Wilberforce, thought, oh, that was too low class for him, for he had many servants in his many mansions, and he certainly was not in a ditch. So he changed the name to something he thought would be more suitable for him, Wilberforce. Let us see how God would work, how he would pierce the heart of a wealthy young man and use him for his glory, taking William Wilberforce the Younger from a force to a servant of the Most High God, who had an iron will for the work God called him to. He became a man that could not be bought, shamed, or influenced. In his journal on October 28, 1787, Wilberforce wrote, God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners. When William Wilberforce was just 9 years old, his father died, and he was sent to live with a wealthy aunt and uncle in London, who, unbeknownst to William's mother, had become not only Methodists, but leaders in the Methodist movement, and introduced a love for Jesus and the Bible to young William, as well as shunning the worldly pursuits of their class. Through them, young William was deeply exposed to evangelical teachings and formed a close childhood bond with John Newton, the famous former slave trader who wrote the famous hymn, Amazing Grace. At the time, polite British society utterly despised Methodism, viewing it as low class, fanatical religious cult. Terrified that her young son would be socially ruined by this intense religion, his mother swooped in and dragged him away from his aunt and uncle's home. She intentionally plunged him into a world of wealth and gambling and high society parties to erase his faith. But decades later, the spiritual seeds planted by his aunt, uncle, and John Newton would bloom and alter the course of human history. Wilberforce grew up to be highly charismatic and witty, one of the nation's most wealthy men, and became a gambler and was a brilliant orator, highly skilled in debating. He was also gifted with a rare voice in both speaking and singing that drew people to hear him even at great distances. His voice so melodic, he was known as the Nightingale of the House of Commons. He was a very small man and plagued with poor eyesight and a horrible intestinal tract. Wilberforce suffered from severe ulcerative colitis his entire adult life, leaving him frail and in agonizing pain. Doctors prescribed him opium, the only painkiller available at the time, and remarkably, he managed the opium doses perfectly for decades, never succumbing to the haze of addiction, and fought his political battles while physically crippled by pain. At just 21 years old, and against all odds, and in a very clever way, and by God's grace for sure, he won a seat in Parliament, a most powerful seat in Parliament, alongside his best friend, Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger. They were not just friends. They were knit together in life, and after death they are buried side by side, along with their giant statues. After the wonderful introduction to Jesus by his aunt and uncle in his childhood, and then the worldly shaping of him into his mid-20s, on a tour in Europe, he experienced a conversion to Christ. Plagued with guilt over his political ambition and wasted years like those of the prodigal son, he fell into what they said was a mad depression. He was going to forsake it all and leave politics and wealthy life and influence altogether. It had been many years since he last saw John Newton, and he went to John Newton in secret and by night, and fully prepared to quit politics to become a minister of the gospel. Newton gave him life-altering advice. Stay in Parliament. God can use you right where you are, and said to him, do you not know you were made for such a time as this? His first objective, in both the slave trade and slavery, the audacious tactics, describe the uphill battle. Slavery was the backbone of the British economy, but there were very few slaves in England, so the people had no idea what slavery really was about, and chose to delude themselves that slavery was good for them. They completely ignored what the Bible said, though many were professed Church of England members. Wilberforce and the abolitionists used radical public awareness campaigns. They brought the reality of the slave trade into Parliament using diagrams of slave ships packed like cargo alongside actual chains and branding irons. Wilberforce said, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know. Although Wilberforce would drive the nail into the coffin, there were others who supported him and hated slavery and fought to end it. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodists, influenced Wilberforce when a boy, living with his aunt and uncle, being influenced by those hated Methodists. He had been fighting against the slave trade for decades, calling it the vilest of villainies. In 1791, Wilberforce was a young MP in his early 30s, and his political campaign to end the slave trade was hitting a massive brick wall. He was exhausted, slandered, and deeply discouraged. 6 days before John Wesley died, the 88-year-old preacher sat down with a faltering hand and wrote his very last letter, and he wrote it to William Wilberforce. Like Newton, Wesley's counsel altered Wilberforce's life, and he would carry the letter with him in his pocket, often removing it when he was most discouraged. Wesley wrote, "Unless the divine power has called you to be as Athanasius against the world, I see not how you can go through your glorious enterprise in opposing that execrable villainy, which is the scandal of religion, of England, and of humanity. But God has raised you up for this very thing, and you will be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. But if God be for you, who could be against you? Oh, be not weary of well-doing. Go on in the name of God and in the power of his might." And here we have on the left a book cover, and it introduces our next person in Wilberforce's life. The name of the cover, "The First and Last King of Haiti, The Rise and Fall of Henry Christophe." Slave, revolutionary, king. Taken together, these words describe only one man, Henry Christophe I of Haiti. Born in 1767 to an enslaved mother on the island of Grenada, he first fought to overthrow the British in North America during the American Revolutionary War, before helping enslaved Africans in Saint Domingue, as Haiti was then called, to gain freedom from slavery. After the revolution, Christophe offered to lead independent Haiti and became the country's first, last, and only king. But it all came to a sudden and tragic end after only 13 years. 1802, Napoleon sent a massive, brutal army to Haiti to force newly freed Black citizens back into literal chains. And there his forces collided with a legendary Black general named Henry Christophe, the man who would eventually become King Henry I of Haiti. King Henry and the Haitian people fiercely resisted, and Christophe famously burned his own palace and capital to the ground rather than surrender it to the French. And the Haitians utterly crushed Napoleon's forces, delivering a humiliating blow to his global empire. King Henry reached out to Wilberforce, and the two formed a deep, long-distance relationship. Wilberforce didn't just want the Haitians to be free. He wanted them to thrive. In 1815, King Henry sent Wilberforce a letter so massive it weighed 85 pounds. The British Post Office was so moved by their partnership that they waived the enormous shipping fee. Now, relative to 1815 wages, that was an astronomical sum, equal to a full year's salary for an average British worker at the time. In terms of modern income status, that charge would feel like roughly 45 to 50,000 US dollars today. Wilberforce sent British school teachers, medical professionals, and agricultural experts to Haiti to help King Henry build a nationwide public education system from scratch. Wilberforce even sent Bibles and the Anglican prayer book for them to read. These two men were attempting to replace the Catholic religion with Protestantism. Is it any wonder that Wilberforce is now neglected in the universities? It was a year after the Bibles arrived that King Henry's rule came to an end. Although the beginning of this new Haiti was exciting and looked promising, it ended in bloodshed and a great disappointment for Wilberforce. King Henry's downfall came from his own intense drive. He was a perfectionist and became increasingly autocratic, demanding ruler. He forced his citizens to work grueling hours on the plantations to keep the economy booming. The people grew resentful, viewing him as a tyrant who was acting too much like the old French masters. In August 1820, while attending church service, King Henry suffered a massive paralyzing stroke. He was left completely unable to walk or ride his horse. Sensing weakness, his own military troops and the rival republic in the south launched a mutiny. As the rebel army marched toward his majestic Sans-Souci palace, Henry's bodyguards abandoned him, realizing he was trapped, paralyzed, and about to be captured by his enemies. King Henry dressed in his finest white royal uniform. On October 8th, 1820, he sat down on his bed and committed suicide. And legend has it, he made a silver bullet to shoot himself in the heart. He was 53 years old. Going back in our story of Wilberforce, back in time, he had many lost battles trying to end slavery. One involved the first London performance since France declared war on Britain in 1793. There was every reason to think that that night would be a triumph, and it was. True Britain reported that the premiere had been attended by a large and splendid audience. But March 15th also marked a triumph of a more insidious kind, a triumph that nearly ended Wilberforce's parliamentary career. On the very night of the premiere, a crucial vote took place in the House of Commons on Wilberforce's bill to abolish the British slave trade. The debate would decide the fate of this bill, whether countless sons and daughters of Africa would continue to be enslaved, or whether the British traffic in human flesh would end. For several weeks leading up to the March 15 debate, there were promising signs for a successful conclusion to what had been Wilberforce's consuming passion for 9 years. His opponents, however, hit a subtle tactic to shipwreck the bill. Capitalizing on the popularity of the opera premiere, they made free tickets provided for Wilberforce's more lukewarm supporters. The sabotage attempt worked, and in a terse diary entry, Wilberforce wrote about the devastating defeat. My slave bill was thrown out by 74 to 70. 10 or 12 of those who had supported me were absent in the country or away on pleasure, and enough were at the opera to have carried it. Seeking counsel, Wilberforce wrote a letter to his old friend and spiritual mentor, John Newton, the former slave trader turned clergyman. Newton's reply was eloquent and imbued with great wisdom. If God had not yet allowed Wilberforce to be dismissed from Parliament, he should take that as a token for good. Some of God's people may be emphatically said not to live to themselves. May it not be said of you? You meet with many things which weary and disgust you, but then they are inseparably connected with your path of duty. And although you cannot do all the good you wish for, some good is done. Just as Esther had been put in the palace of King Xerxes for such a time as this, Newton wrote, One may not be able to calculate all the advantages that may result from your service in public life. The example and even the presence of a consistent character may have a powerful, though unobserved, effect upon others. You are in a place where many know him not and can show them the genuine fruits of the religion you are known to profess. Newton wisely reminded Wilberforce that he had already accomplished a great deal. Though you have not as yet fully succeeded in your persevering endeavors to abolish the slave trade, since you took it in hand, the condition of the slaves in our islands has undoubtedly been already improved. These improvements were proof that you have not labored in vain. Newton next pointed to another Bible character who had served long, faithfully, and well under trying circumstances. Like Daniel, Wilberforce knew the loneliness of being a trailblazer. It is true, Newton conceded, that you live in the midst of difficulties and snares, and you need a double guard of watchfulness and prayer. But since you know both your need of help and where to look for it, I may say to you, as Darius to Daniel, thy God, whom thou servest continually, is able to preserve and deliver you. Daniel likewise was a public man and a critical man, but he trusted in the Lord, was faithful in his department, and therefore, though he had enemies, they could not prevail against him. Indeed, Newton continued, the great point of comfort in life is to have a well-grounded persuasion that we are where all things considered we ought to be. Then it is no great matter whether we are in public or in private life, in a city or a village, in a palace or a cottage. The promise, my grace is sufficient for thee, is necessary to support us in the smoothest scenes and is equally able to support us in the most difficult. Neither man knew that 11 long years would pass before the goal was finally reached. The slave trade was legally abolished in the spring of 1807, and Newton died the same year, but not before hearing the news from his friend Wilberforce, the defeated crusader who had fought strength beyond himself to keep fighting. After 2 decades of Wilberforce fighting and losing the battle in Parliament, the Slave Trade Act finally passed. During the debate, the Attorney General gave a speech comparing the peaceful conscience of Wilberforce to the bloody ambition of Napoleon. The entire Parliament stood and cheered. Wilberforce sat at his desk, head in his hands, weeping tears of relief. Through those 20 years, Wilberforce wept much every time Parliament said no to ending the trade. One instance was with France and Napoleon. Napoleon's tyranny, 1799 to 1814. In France, he instituted forced conscription, enslaving an entire generation of young Frenchmen by turning them into disposable property to fuel his endless wars of personal ambition. Abroad, he fiercely fought to reestablish and expand the horrific slave trade, reversing the French Revolution's earlier abolition of slavery. In 1814, the war had ended between Britain and France, and Napoleon was exiled in Elba, and there was a new king on the French throne. and it was looking like France would end the French slave trade. And then the French king decided to not end the slave trade. It was just too profitable. But most of all, English people like Wilberforce were trying to influence him to end the slave trade, and he hated England so much that he did not want to concede to an Englishman's wish. So he said, maybe in 5 years I'll end it. And Wilberforce tearfully wrote in his diary about how many men, women, and children made in the image of God would suffer for 5 more years in this slave system. And then thousands and thousands of them would, in Wilberforce's dreams, cry out for help. And Wilberforce wept. But let's see how God worked next in a miracle orchestrated by God. Just 100 days after his dramatic return, England and the Allies decisively crushed Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, June 1815. This time, the British took no chances, exiling him thousands of miles away to the remote island of St. Helena so he could never escape again. When the French king crept back to his throne in Paris, he was furious. He immediately ordered every single law to be changed and changed Napoleon enacted during his brief return to be utterly erased from history. But the king walked into a divine trap. He realized there was only one law he could not reverse: the abolition of the slave trade. If he legalized the slave trade again, he would look more morally bankrupt to the world than the tyrant Napoleon. So, under intense British scrutiny, the ban stood permanently. It is amazing how God worked, using the desperate ambition of a dictator and the humiliated pride of a stubborn French king to permanently free thousands of human beings. This brings us to the ultimate miraculous twist of divine irony. During Napoleon's final 100 days in power, this same slavery tyrant who had enslaved his own citizens for war and spilled oceans of blood trying to destroy Haitian freedom was the very tool God used to permanently ban the French slave trade in his desperate failed attempt to win England's favor. What a brutal dictator meant for tyranny and disregard of men, women, and children, God masterfully routed into ultimate liberation. In 1807, the English slave trade was ended, but not the English slave system. And that continued to prosper and benefit the owners of the slaves and destroy the lives of the slaves. And Wilberforce continued on to fight and to weep for them. But Wilberforce did not work alone. He was the leader of a group of wealthy Christian social reformers who all bought houses in the neighborhood of Clapham, England, so they could live, pray, and strategize together. They were mockingly called the Clapham sect by their enemies. These men and women did not just share a common bond, a common interest in setting. They shared a love for Christ and a deep need to pray together often for each other and the great object they labored for. So they bought houses next to each other, and they would just walk right in and enter each other's houses without knocking, day or night, just coming over whenever they felt like it. This was unheard of in the 1800s of England. These men labored together with Wilberforce to end slavery. The war between England and France and the war on the slave trade happened at the same time. Abolition became the political pawn. Wilberforce would not relent, even though it put him at odds with his very best friend and the Prime Minister William Pitt, who had chosen to put all his energy into the war with France instead of ending slavery. Wilberforce was called by the secular world the greatest reformer in history. How could that be? Let us now look at the second great object God placed before Wilberforce, the reformation of manners. And remember, this one was dangerous. Manners didn't mean etiquette. It meant moral character, compassion, and human dignity. He believed that a just society must educate the poor so they could think, read the scriptures, and care for themselves, breaking the cycle of systemic dependency and abuse. You see, there was no welfare back then. So when they said breaking the cycle of systemic dependency, that meant breaking the cycle of begging for bread. The 70 plus social projects that Wilberforce enacted. He wasn't a one issue politician. His wealth went into over 70 charities, fighting for the chimney sweeps, educating the illiterate, reforming hospitals, and fighting poverty. From 1793, Wilberforce fought grueling battles against the mega-powerful East India Company to force them to allow Christian missionaries and educators into India, opening the door for social reforms like ending the practice of sati, the burning of widows. Co-founding the RSPCA because of his eccentric love for animals and his belief that a moral society should not tolerate cruelty. Wilberforce co-founded the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in 1823. In 1797, he wrote a book titled A Practical View of Christianity. Publishers thought it would fail, but it was highly successful, going through 5 editions in 6 months and shifting the cultural tide of England toward active faith. A private faith that does not act in the face of oppression is no faith at all. But he could have never accomplished the second great object without God bringing into his life Hannah More. While William Wilberforce fought the political battle against slavery in the halls of Parliament, Hannah More fought the cultural and moral battles in the hearts of the British public. She was a playwright, a poet, a fierce abolitionist, a pioneer of education for the poor, and the undisputed literary powerhouse of the evangelical Clapham sect. Blessed with an incredible intellect, she moved to London in the 1770s and became a core member of the Blue Stockings, a group of elite intellectual women who hosted literary salons to replace gossip and card games with brilliant conversation. She was the darling of British cultural elite. She was a close personal friend of Dr. Samuel Johnson, who openly praised her wit, the great statesman Edmund Burke, and the legendary actor-producer David Garrick, who produced her hit tragedy play Percy to roaring success in 1777. By the mid-1780s, the glitter of London society began to fade for More. The deaths of her close friends, David Garrick, and Samuel Johnson, forced her to confront the fleeting nature of worldly fame. Through the writings and personal mentorship of John Newton, the former slave trader who wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, Moore underwent a true conversion. She realized that the lavish parties and gambling and superficial moral decay of the elite were spiritually bankrupt, and she walked away from the theater world entirely and resolved to spend her immense writing talent exclusively for social reform and God's glory. In 1787, Hannah More met William Wilberforce, and they instantly recognized each other as kindred spirits and became lifelong friends and intellectual partners. Wilberforce famously noted that while he could change laws, Hannah More could change manners and morals. To support Wilberforce's first major anti-slavery push in Parliament, she published Slavery, a Poem in 1788. It starkly exposed the horrors of the slave trade, vividly depicted the suffering of chained captives, and challenged British Christians to see enslaved Africans as their spiritual equals. It was distributed to every single member of Parliament. During a visit to the Mendip Hills in Somerset, Wilberforce and More were horrified by the lawlessness, starvation, and total lack of education among the poor mining communities. Wilberforce looked at that systemic neglect and said, "If you will be at the trouble, I will be at the expense." The Mendip schools were started. Alongside her sister Martha, Hannah set up schools and evening classes across the region. They didn't just teach children to read the Bible, they taught practical skills like spinning to help women achieve financial independence. Her schools were so successful that local traditionalist clergymen panicked. They accused her of being a radical and a hidden Methodist, a massive insult at the time meant to imply anti-establishment rebellion, because she allowed extemporaneous prayer. Imagine that. Instead of praying a creed, you just prayed to God as the Holy Spirit moved your heart. Despite years of intense public backlash that physically made her ill, she refused to shut the schools down. The cheap repository tracts she started handing out to counter the violent, godless ideas of the French Revolution filtering into England. She wrote short, vivid, inexpensive stories for the working class. They promoted Christian morality and personal responsibility, selling over 2 million copies in a single year, outselling almost everything else in the country. Hannah More never married. She had been engaged in her 20s to a wealthy landowner named William Turner, but after he repeatedly postponed the wedding for 6 years, she broke it off. Plagued by guilt, Turner settled an annual annuity on her, which ironically gave her the financial independence to pursue her writing without needing a husband. One of her books outsold Jane Austen many times over. Hannah More died September 7, 1833, at the age of 88. Her timing was poetic. She lived just long enough to see her life's ultimate goal realized. The Slavery Abolition Act was passed August 18, 1833, legally ending slavery across the British Empire. Hallelujah. Her dear friend William Wilberforce had died just a few weeks before her, knowing the battle was won. Upon her death, it was discovered she had amassed a fortune of roughly millions of dollars today entirely from book royalties. And she left every single penny to charities, schools, and religious organizations. At her funeral, there were not the huge London crowds, not the legislators, not the famous and well educated. None of the famous people were there. Instead, a massive procession of hundreds and hundreds of poor children from the Mendip schools she had founded lined the road, weeping for the woman who God used to give them literacy and a future. Balance heavy history with his personality. He was famously eccentric, turning his home into a chaotic sanctuary filled with rescued animals, including a pig, a monkey, and various birds. And he would travel with some of them. The people would remark it was a regular zoo, a traveling zoo. Another interesting thing about Wilberforce was his walk to work every day. When he got to Hyde Park, he knew it was the exact distance to Parliament to quote the entire Psalm 119. So he would say it on the way to work and on the way home. He also kept a journal of every person he tried to witness to, of the things about them that he could try to get them interested in the gospel. And he would write how he had used it in conversation, what failed and what worked, and how he would try again. And he would note what was the most successful ways. He really cared about each person coming to Christ. It was not form and function for Wilberforce. He was co-laboring with Jesus for the salvation of his brothers and sisters. Unlike many wealthy politicians of his day who kept mistresses, he was devoted and faithful to his wife, Barbara Spooner. She cared and served him through all his illness and suffering. She was criticized for being too below Wilberforce's standing, but Wilberforce proposed to her within 10 days of meeting. He married her 45 days after in 1797, and they shared a lifetime of love and faithfulness to each other and to God. Charles Wesley, John's brother and the famous hymn writer, was also an early voice crying out against the moral horror of slavery. He and Wilberforce's paths intertwined in the small evangelical circles of London. Charles passed away in 1788, just as Wilberforce was beginning his parliamentary battle. But when Charles died, he left his widow Sarah and their children in an incredibly precarious financial situation. Moved by Charles's life and music and boyhood memories of his aunt and uncle's relationship with him, Wilberforce quietly stepped in and financially supported Charles Wesley's widow out of his own pocket for the rest of her life. It is a beautiful hidden testament to Wilberforce's character. He didn't just honor the great Methodist leaders in theory or in name. He took care of their families when they were gone. And Wilberforce did not just care for his wealthy friends, but his servants. In England, when a servant who faithfully served all their lives in a man's house, when they got old or infirm or crippled or sick, their service was terminated and they were turned out into the street. Often they had nowhere to go. There was no welfare program, no social security, no disability programs. But Wilberforce would not terminate them. He kept them and cared for them in his home their entire lives, even when the wealthy, influential politicians would come over and remark negatively about his aged or slow or sick or clumsy servants who had outlived their usefulness. Wilberforce did not care or think so. What impact did Wilberforce have on the Seventh-day Adventist? I found this interesting fact. John Byington, 1798 to 1887, the Seventh-day Adventist pioneer, named his son after William Wilberforce and was the first president of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, 1863 to 1865. Before accepting the Seventh-day Sabbath in 1852, Byington was an ardent Methodist minister and a staunch abolitionist in upstate New York. To reflect his deep anti-slavery convictions, Byington named two of his sons after famous Christian abolitionists. William WIlberforce Byington, born December 26, 1840, and Luther Lee Byington, named after Luther Lee, the founder of the Wesleyan Methodist Connection. Here we have briefly shared the life of a man who was once one of the wealthiest, most powerful politicians in England, but died financially destitute, living in his son's care and home without a penny to his name. He had given all his wealth, all his lands, all his mansions to the cause, and his very last money was spent bailing out his eldest son's failed business. Yet he would cheerfully remark often that it was a great blessing to get to live with his son and share their lives. The newspapers and writers wrote great things about his monumental work at the end of his life. But his last words on earth were not about his achievements. They showed he valued what mattered most of all. Looking to his family gathered by his side, his final words before he died were, "My affections are so much in heaven that I can leave you all without a regret. Yet I do not love you less, but God more." On July 26, 1833, he received word on his deathbed that Parliament had passed the Slavery Abolition Act, freeing all slaves across the British Empire. He died 3 days later, his life's work complete. The nation gave him a majestic state funeral at Westminster Abbey. Wilberforce was heralded through the streets of England with a giant statue erected to honor him, and truly the entire nation mourned his passing. William Wilberforce fought for 46 years against staggering odds, powerful men, and massive financial interests to achieve what he called his two great objects: the abolition of the slave trade and the reformation of society's character, to free men, women, and children from an evil system that only a handful originally opposed seemed impossible. Along the way, his life intersected with the staggering tapestry of history, from King George III to King Henry and the desperate decrees of Napoleon, and alongside the brilliant, faithful heroes who supported him, the Wesleys, John Newton, Hannah More, and the Clapham sect. Yet today, he remains largely unknown, and those who do recognize his name only know of his fight against slavery. His 70-plus massive social and educational projects are completely forgotten. But he would never claim a single ounce of credit for himself. His rare dual nature of bold, charismatic temperament mixed with humble kindness influenced and reshaped the entire moral landscape of an empire and can be summed up by historians very well here. When Wilberforce was 60 years old, he was visiting a relative and noticed their baby crawling around on the floor. Without a second thought, this great statesman got down on his knees, on his hands and knees, to play and laugh with a child. He had no idea that this little baby would grow up to become Queen Victoria. Historians have noted Queen Victoria lent the era her name, but Wilberforce lent the era his character. What have you brought to this world, to your home, to your friends, to your family and workplace? Could it be said that you bring a Christ-like character that transforms a place, a time, and the people there, making it better than before? In the end, it was not William Wilberforce's own character that he gave to England. It was the character of our Heavenly Father and His Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.